Hi everyone. Hope you had a great week. You all had great discussion entries this week and I really enjoyed reading them. This week we will be focusing specifically on religious pluralism and define what religious pluralism means. We will read what religion pluralism means to Alan Race, Hicks and Paniker and compare between their theology of religions. This week we will also watch two videos. One is on the theory of religious pluralism with Jose Casanova and Peter Berger at the Berkeley Center, which is at Georgetown actually, and the other one is with Pamela Geller on Hannity. So for this week, one of the main objectives we have is to understand what we mean by religious pluralism. And we will also analyze and synthesize both overt and covert differences between religious citizens and explore how these manifest in social interactions. In that sense, we will also explore how exclusivist religious perspective manifests into hostile social rhetoric. And finally, we will also analyze how religious differences excite social conflict. And we will look at some different examples on that and explore suggestions for solutions. So today, religious pluralism is an important issue. And this has become more and more important as our modern world, we are less culturally and religiously homogeneous. Also, we travel more, move to other parts of the world, and learn about other communities through a variety of different media, including social media. So in our globalized world, we're living in much more close proximity to, and we also meeting people from different religious traditions. And these traditions are also increasingly being used by groups to incite violence towards others and create stereotypes about other groups. Around the 18th, 19th centuries especially, with the rise of human-centered approaches and Renaissance and following that the Enlightenment, it was assumed that modern societies will become much more secular and the role of religion will diminish in public life. In fact, Auguste Comte talked about how eventually we would come to a stage where we're all more scientific and called this stage a positivist stage. But what we're seeing today is that this has not been realized, and religion continues to play a very significant role in many people's lives and in many people's political, social, economic decisions. But religious pluralism is not something that is easily achieved, and in this context, when religion is being used to incite violence and conflict, we really need to understand what about religion that makes it particularly challenging for conflict situations. So if we look at religion, each religious tradition claims to hold truth, and this truth often excludes truths of other religions. And that's one of the really important qualities or important perspectives on religion. While modern scientific truth is logically, empirically verifiable, religious truth is absolute. The religious community assumes that truth to be complete and changeless, and it does not require that truth to be verified. It just requires to have a leap of faith, just to believe in it. So in that sense, it is not easy to prove religion and explain that or sort of prove that your religious perspective is more true than others. Also, religious traditions hold some deep differences in the way they understand reality. And this makes different religious traditions who hold very different perspectives on reality to be incommensurable. So religious traditions as a moral order also influence our identities. They inform our social roles, the social, political, economic structures, and the underlying worldviews of the communities. Religion addresses some of the most profound existential issues of human life, such as freedom, inevitability, fear or security, right, wrong, sacred, profane, among many others, because religion is a powerful constituent of cultural norms and values, and it embodies and elaborates upon its highest morals and ethical principles and ideals of social harmony. So religion also informs how people think, how people act, and how people perceive what their interests are and their priorities. We also find that religious feelings can often mobilize people much faster than other elements of their identity. Religion informs our attitudes, our behaviors towards members of our own religious group, as well as those who are not part of our own group. Because of its exclusivist nature, religious pluralism has been a very difficult issue. We also have to remember that within each religious tradition, there are differences of interpretation on the issue of religious pluralism as well. So, Alan Race defines exclusivism as the position that holds salvation is available through personal knowledge of and commitment to Jesus Christ, predominantly the attitude of the church. And we could see that there is a similar attitude in other religious traditions, which argues that individuals can only hold salvation or only can get into heaven if they follow their own religious path. Alan Race also defines inclusivism as both an acceptance and rejection of the other faiths. It accepts the spiritual power and depth so they can be called the locus of divine presence, but it's still not sufficient for salvation, according to Alan Race. Hicks, on the other hand, talks about pluralism and defines it as different religious traditions have authentic religious value and each can lead to salvation and liberation. The issue of who has access to salvation is an interesting one, actually. I personally experienced this in one of the work that I was doing in interfaith dialogue. I was one of the facilitators of an interdialogue between the evangelical Christians and Muslims in the United States in 2005-2006. While both communities were able to agree on the importance of issues such as freedom of practicing one's religion, working towards peace, one area that got us into a deadlock was who gets to heaven after death. For Muslims present at that interfaith dialogue, they believe that according to Islamic tradition, Jews and Christians will also eventually get to heaven as long as they believe in the afterlife and the reckoning and judgment. Whereas the Christians held the view that only those who believe Jesus is the Christ will enter into heaven or be saved. This was an important issue for Muslims because it was an indication of their worth in the eyes of their fellow Christians. Being viewed as not worthy of heaven or salvation was perceived to be seen as not being of the same value. So this was indicating to Muslims the centrality of religious pluralism. While our political system in the United States is based on separation of religion and politics and acknowledges freedom of religion and protects the right of everyone to practice their own religious tradition without fear of persecution, faith groups may still hold exclusivist attitudes when there is a conflict. And especially when there is a conflict, these exclusivist attitudes can contribute to the dehumanization of the other and escalate the conflict. Also, each religious tradition, as I said earlier, has multiple attitudes and different interpretations within itself. And this was another issue we faced within that same interfaith dialogue process that I just mentioned earlier. And Muslims who were participating in that dialogue were coming from a variety of different backgrounds, from Iran, from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan, and they included different sects and different interpretations within each tradition, whereas the evangelicals were coming from one particular tradition, and there was less differences of interpretation among the evangelical community. So during the interfaith dialogue, one of the things that we realized that it was so important, especially when you have a diverse group representing one tradition, to have an intra-group dialogue before the interfaith dialogue itself. And this intragroup dialogue should be aimed at identifying areas of difference as well as areas of agreement before that group could participate in an interfaith dialogue. So one of the lessons is that before any interfaith dialogue, to hold intra-group discussions to identify differences of opinion as well as areas of agreement and how you will present yourself to the other, religious other, and make those decisions beforehand. So this is also something that Panikar suggests in his approach to religious pluralism. So what is religious pluralism? What are the advantages of practicing religious pluralism as a mediator in conflicts? So for our discussion due on Wednesday, we'll ask you to watch a video regarding the freedom of speech with Geller and discuss if there should be a line drawn between freedom of speech and respecting sensitivities of different religious traditions. So, in your opinion, did Geller's organization cross a moral order held in high regard by Muslims? Should there be a line drawn that suggests respecting religion and faith when practicing religious freedom or freedom of speech? We will also discuss if there are any disadvantages to practicing religious pluralism as a mediator, and if so, what aspects of religious pluralism might be useful in the Geller case to ensure groups do not intentionally or unintentionally undermine or disrespect or cross a line another group's religious moral order. For the collaboration discussion this week, we'll ask you to reflect on your own capstone project for the MA in an Interfaith Action degree program. So, in that project, do you anticipate actors practicing religious pluralism? If so, at what level? Also, I'll ask you to reflect on how important will religious pluralism be to the practice of effective interfaith relations in your project. Of course, as usual, please review at least 2 of your colleagues' posts and propose strategies for your colleagues to exercise religious pluralism and mutual understanding. So thank you again and see you next week. I hope you will have a wonderful week this week.